Good afternoon or good morning. Welcome to today's webinar about Capture One for Sony. So the purpose really of this webinar is to look at Capture One Express for Sony, the free version. Keep it nice and simple, how to get started with that, do some basic workflow tasks like getting images in and organization and so on, and then some basic adjustment tasks, and then finally exporting as well. Excuse me, this is your first webinar and you don't know who you're listening to, my name is David. I'm part of the software sales team based out of Copenhagen in Denmark. And we'll have around 60 minutes with each other today. You are very welcome to ask questions throughout. If you look at the bottom of your GoToWebinar control panel, you'll see a section called questions. Just put a question in there that will come straight through to me. If you're on your Android device or iOS device, there's a question mark icon in the bottom of the app. Just tap that and you can ask a question in a similar way. Please try to keep your questions on subject. If you have anything that isn't really related to today, you're welcome to just pop that in the survey afterwards, or of course wait for another webinar on that subject, of which there are plenty. Just helps to keep the subject on track, not really for my benefit, but for everyone else listening as well. I am recording the webinar too, so should you want to watch again, you can do so, and then you'll be able to see that probably tomorrow. But you'll get a follow-up email with links to the location of this recording and also all the other recordings as well. So just bear with me while I switch screens and do a few other things, and then you should be, or rather we should be all good to go. Okay, so you should be able to see just about now my system preferences right now. I'm just going to start up a little mouse locating application. So just to help you see the mouse on screen at any point as well. So what I'll do is, we won't go through the installation process. I'm sure you're all smart enough to manage that. I'm working on a Mac, as you can see, but the process is pretty much identical for PC as well. So don't worry if you're on a PC, everything will look much the same. So if I launch Capture One, like so, and I should add that the installation or the download for Capture One Express, Capture One Pro is identical. So you don't have to go out if you decide to upgrade to Pro at a later date to download something else. It's just the current installation that you have. So Capture One Express, just to be clear, this one here is a totally free version. You can use it forever, in theory. And that supports all Sony cameras. There's a complete list of supported cameras on our website. But it has a limited feature set than the Pro version. And we'll have a look at the Pro version in the last 5 or 10 minutes just so you know exactly the difference. But Express for Sony and Pro for Sony, only Sony cameras. Pro for Sony and Pro, it's the same application, but Pro for Sony is only for Sony cameras, and of course a much lower price point as well. So let's hit the Express button, and then that will open up Capture One like so, and it will create a catalog for you, which we will talk about in a second. This screen you will see popping up, which encourages you to upgrade for $50/50 €. Don't just automatically close it. There is the Getting Started tab, which has a good Getting Started video. There's a tutorial tab, which you can click through for various other things as well. And the content is dynamic. So it is worth keeping it around because we do change the content every now and then as well. And you can just hit the close button like so. So Capture One will present itself for you like so, and it will open up in what is the default Express workspace. So the way Capture One is laid out is that we have tools on the left-hand side. We have a viewer area here, and if we had any images in our catalog, then they would be shown over here. Once we get some more images inside the catalog, then we can talk a little bit more about customization and some basic operations. But just so you're aware, the only thing that's really happened so far in our startup process is that Capture One has made this file here, the Capture One catalog, which is basically a database which tracks the location of all your images and knows certain things about them, like the adjustments applied, metadata, ratings, all that kind of stuff. And it also contains a small preview image of every single image that you import, which helps to keep the application running nice and fast and quick. Okay, before we get into anything else, we're actually going to get some images into Capture One so you can see how the layout works and so on. So if you haven't noticed, there's an extremely large button in the center that says Import Images. Now, Capture One Express, it's not a browser, so you can't go around and browse your system for images. You have to make a dedicated import into the catalog. So what I've got is a memory card with some images on it and a card reader, of course. So I'm just going to put that card into my card reader like so, not that you can see it. And then automatically, generally, the card will be detected, and then this window will pop up, which is the import window. So this is the contents of my memory card, just so you can see what I popped in. It's this one here, like so, which just has a bunch of images from mostly Sony cameras on the card itself. So that will automatically open up the import window. Now, really, there's only two things you have to get right in the import window. That's the import from. So where am I getting my images from? So in this case, that's my memory card, which we just looked at. Of course, you could be importing from an existing folder structure on your laptop or computer or external hard drives or anywhere really, as long as the system can see them, Capture One can see them. We can drop into this menu and choose a different folder of images if we wish, and we can also elect to read all subfolders as well if we wish to. And that's a good choice if you're importing from, say, an existing hard drive. Let's say we wanted to import everything from, say, this folder, or even say all of these folders. I could select this folder and Capture One would import everything in that subfolder tree. But right now in this example, we're just going to import from a memory card. And really the next thing you have to worry about is where do we want those images to go? So we've got a few options here in the import to section. So the first field says destination. Where are these images that I'm looking at here? Where are they going to end up? So we could say current location, which would mean they would stay on the memory card and Capture One would know how to access them. But we don't want to leave those images on the memory card because we're going to put that memory card back in our camera and format it once more and carry on shooting. The only reason why we would use current location is if we were importing from an existing location on our system and we wanted the images to stay there, but we wanted Capture One to know how to access them. We can say inside catalog, which if you're used to using Aperture, for example, or Photos from Apple and various other applications, what inside catalog does is that it physically copies the images inside the Capture One catalog. And that makes for very simple organization and the ability to pick up this catalog and move it anywhere and be able to open it with all the images inside. But of course, the size of that catalog is limited to the size of available space on your hard drive. And of course, we know in this day and age that it doesn't take very long to fill up a hard drive with images, but it's good for smaller catalogs as such. So the obvious choice really is to choose a location where you want to put those images. So if I say choose folder, we get a dialog pop up here. So in my pictures folder, I'm going to make a new folder called my Capture One images, like so, and then say set as import folder. So now we've got the destination as my Capture One images, and a further little empty box pops up here called subfolder. So we can manually write in here the name of a subfolder that we might like to automatically create. And the nice thing about that is it's highly likely that as I continue to import images into Capture One, they're always going to go into the same destination, but I might like to divide them up a bit into subcategories. And this could be by event, for example. So if these were images from vacation 2017, for example, I could just type in there and Capture One would make me a folder automatically right here if I wish. Saves me having to do those kind of things in the Finder or Windows Explorer. Or we can ask Capture One to automatically create a folder based on some kind of information from the image itself. So an obvious thing could be the date that the image was captured. So if we wanted Capture One to move all these images into folders based on the date they were captured, that's a very simple thing we can do. So if I tap on this button here, this opens the location subfolder window, and if we scroll down, there's loads of these tokens, as we call them, but you'll find one called image date. So if I drag this up here, then Capture One will sort by month, day, and year. But if you want a different order, we can click on the drop-down arrow like so, and then you can choose different formats, and you get a sample of how the format's going to look there, for example, like so, and even by the time it was captured too, if you want to go that far. So I'm going to pick this format, why not? So it simply means whatever date that image was captured, it will go in a folder with named by the convention here on the date it was captured. You'll see once we finish the import. Everything else under here is kind of bonus. So as long as you get import from and import to right, you're good to go. But we have further options for creating a backup of the raw files. We can rename the images as they import if we wish, again by using tokens, like so. We can add some basic metadata. We can click on any image and see some basic information about it too. And if we want to, we can apply some adjustments by just ticking the auto adjust box, which I'm going to do. Saves us a bit of time because Capture One does a nice job of the auto adjustments. And we can also apply, if we want, a user style or a built-in style, which is a set of adjustments, and also presets. For example, if I wanted to add my basic metadata, then I could do so as well because I've previously saved a preset allowing me to do so. So all happy, good to go. Importing from the card, importing to this folder. If you want to check where that is, tap the arrow, and then it shows you in the Finder or the Windows Explorer where it's going to go. We're going to automatically make a subfolder based on the date the image was captured, and we're going to auto adjust the images. So if I Command A to select all, and then we can say import 42 shots like so. So those images will start importing like so. So they're being read from the card reader and copied to the internal hard drive. And whilst that's happening, Capture One's also doing auto adjustments as well. Whilst that's happening, Capture One is also making a small preview of every single image that is being imported to. And that simply means that when I'm browsing images, when I'm going back and forth through images in Capture One, we're only looking at the preview. We don't actually have to read the raw data, so it's much faster when we're browsing through images that we don't have to read the raw data. Now, the size of those preview files is quite an important thing to set, particularly in the kind of last couple of years, because there's been much higher resolution monitors coming onto the market. So if we look in our Capture One preferences, for example, in the image tab, you'll see preview image size here by default is set to 2560. So that simply means 2560 pixels across the long edge of the image like so. Now my monitor is no bigger than 2560 pixels, so that's fine. But if you were running like a 4K iMac or a 5K iMac or a 4K display or a 5K display, that means that preview would be too small for the display, and Capture One would then have to read the raw data. And that means when you're zipping back and forth through images, it would be slower. See, I can browse through images nice and fast like so, as you can see. When I zoom into an image at 100%, that's the only time when we need to call up the raw data. But you'll see by moving through images in Capture One, it's still nice and quick. And the 100% view we actually store so that when we go back and forth between images, there's actually no delay in waiting for the image to build up from to 100%. So nice and fast browsing through Capture One. Let's see what happened with our import. If you remember, we asked Capture One to divide up those images based on the date that they were shot, and you can see that's exactly what's happened here. So you can see all the various different folders based on month, day, year. If we look in back into Capture One, and on the left-hand side, the Tools area, you'll see the first tool tab highlighted in orange. And if we look at the bottom, we have the Folders area. If we expand this out, then basically you'll see the exact location of all my images in those various folders, like so, as you can see. So what we're seeing here is an exact copy of what we have on the Finder itself. Before we go any further, let's answer Ozzy's question. I have a Sony camera connected, but in the capture prefs, it shows up as contacts. That's interesting. If we look in preferences, the only preferences for the capture preferences, when we look at Pro, is Sony, Nikon, and so on. So that shouldn't really be happening, Ozzy. But if you've got any further information, let us know. But of course, also get in touch with support if any of you are having issues too. So before we go any further, the main areas of Capture One, we've got the tools and these various tool tabs, which hold the various correction tools we'll talk about soon. We have the viewer, which displays the image, of course, which we can shortcut zoom to 100% and drag around and of course fit screen like so. And then on the right hand side, we have the browser, which has all the various different thumbnails, for example. Now these elements, the tools, and the viewer and the browser, and also we have the toolbar at the top like so, and also the cursor tools in the center, which change the behavior from the cursor to perhaps something like a cropping tool if you were to choose crop here, for example. So these change the behavior of the cursor. These buttons on the left and right are sort of action buttons that turn on something like exposure warning, copy and apply, all kinds of stuff we'll get to a bit later as well. Now, if this layout doesn't suit you, if you go in the View menu, you'll see some basic things you can do, like place the browser below. So if you like to have a film strip underneath, you can do so. Place browser below. If you would prefer to have the tools on the right, we can say place tools on the right. If you're more used to a Lightroom style layout, for example, you can mimic that quite nicely as well. Or we can simply just go back to the default. Let's switch the tools once more, place tools on the left, and you can see it will reverse. So just have a little look in the view menu and see what you can change to maybe make it a bit more sense to you. One thing I would recommend you do is think about keyboard shortcuts. Something that's very nice to be able to do is quickly show and hide the viewer. So if I'm in a grid view like this and I want to open up an image, then I can double click on it and it will open. I can of course browse on the right hand side, but it's quite nice to be able to hide the viewer just so you can quickly go to another image and then double click on it and open up, for example. So that's simply this action here, hide viewer and show viewer. Now the default shortcut isn't the most intuitive one or simple one, but any of the shortcuts in Capture One you can modify. So if you go to Edit Keyboard Shortcuts, then really all you need to do is you see the items at the top here are the same as the items running top to bottom. So if we go to View and then Show Hide Viewer, you can simply change whatever shortcut you want. My preferred shortcut is this key called the period key, which sits one below the escape key, so it's really nice and easy to tap with your left hand, for example, and makes it nice and simple to scroll through images, for example. So just have a little think about shortcuts and the arrangement of Capture One to help you work a little better. Now, finishing off what we were talking about with the import process. So you can see, let's just make the thumbnails bigger. You can see as we go down the various different folders, they contain those various different images, of course. If you want to move stuff around, then really the best advice is to try and do as much of that, or all of that really, in Capture One as possible. So if we want to move this image from this folder to this folder, it's just a simple drag and drop. It physically moves it on the hard drive as well. So you see it's now sitting there, for example. And then if we want to, we can just move it straight back. But by doing it in Capture One, it simply means that the database then stays up to date as well. So Capture One knows that you've moved that image, for example. Now, there is nothing to stop you doing that outside of Capture One, but you're kind of making more work for yourself. So as an example, if we go to this one here, let's grab our rooster and drop him in that folder. And you see straight away, this now has a question mark. If I open it up, you see it says offline at the top because Capture One doesn't know where to access it from. So what we have to do is a locate process. So if I right click and say locate, so right click on the image itself and say locate, then I can go here and then actually pick that image and say open. Then the database location is updated and then it's now back all happy like so. But that's giving yourself an extra step. So any sort of moves like that, just try to do that within Capture One itself. You can also move entire folders if you wish. If you move an entire folder outside of Capture One, you can do the same thing and do a right click on the folder itself and say locate and pick the new location. But as I said, if you do all that stuff in Capture One, then you're going to avoid yourself a whole process. You can also make the catalog aware of additional folders by clicking the plus button. This is not an import process. This is just saying, for example, if I wanted to make an additional folder here, let's just make a new one called portfolio, for example, portfolio, like so. Then it can make me that folder. And if I say add, the catalog is now aware of it. And then if I wanted to, I could drag stuff into that. And again, it will be physically moved on disk. If I want to remove a folder from the catalog, I could just click minus and then it will delete it from the catalog. It won't physically put the folder in the bin. It will just no longer be seen in the catalog. But again, do as much as you can within Capture One itself. Alan is asking, can I work with JPEGs? Yes, you certainly can work with JPEGs, but just remember the sort of scope that you're going to get from, various adjustments if we find something, horribly underexposed, for example. So let's just do Command R to reset that. So this is underexposed, but it's a raw image, of course, but we have plenty of scope to be able to fix that. It's 2 stops under, but no issue whatsoever with adjusting that. If that was shot as a JPEG, then we would not have near as much flexibility to fix images and make adjustments, be creative with them as we would with the raw data. The only disadvantage of the raw data is that it's bigger, but memory cards are cheap these days, hard drives are cheap, so you may as well shoot in raw and get the additional benefit. You can see by importing and doing auto adjustments, we can get a long way to the finished process as such. So really, I would say always shoot raw, much better. Les says, can Capture One generate more than one subfolder? Yes, Les is thinking ahead already. So if we wanted more than one subfolder, let's say we wanted to say vacation 2016 or 2017, then if I do a / like so, and then I could use my token like image date, then yes, Capture One will then generate 2 subfolders, but you could have 10 subfolders if you wanted to, Les. You just have to divide them with the /. If you're on a PC, it's a /, just so you know. On a Mac, it doesn't matter, but on a PC, it's forward or it's a /. So yes, Les, you can definitely do that, and that's a great idea. Does it make sense to make catalogs per years with months and events as subfolders? No right or wrong. Capture One Express is restricted to one catalog. Capture One Pro, you could have multiple catalogs. Some people like to have one big mega catalog. Some people like to have a catalog per year. It's entirely up to you. Just remember the disadvantage of having a catalog per year is that you can't search across multiple catalogs. The advantage of having maybe many smaller catalogs is that if you have some kind of disaster, house burns down, computer explodes or whatever, depending on your backup routine, you might have better chance of recovery. But again, it's all very personal preference. Can I use the touch bar with Capture One? If you're lucky enough to have a new MacBook Pro with touch bar, there isn't any specific integration yet with Capture One, but we're exploring different ways to make it beneficial to your use. So just watch this space and you never know what might come, but nothing as yet, other than the basic commands that is possible. Okay, so where were we? Where were we? Okay, so back to Capture One. All right, so we know how to show and hide our viewer, for example. If we want to hide and show various other elements of the workspace, let's just get an image up, for example. I can do Command B to hide the browser, like so. I can do Command T to hide the tools, if I wish. That would be Control T if you're on the PC. If I press F, I can go to full screen if I want to. And I can still use the various other shortcuts like Command left and right to move through images on full screen if I wish, and then F to come out of full screen again. But again, if you want to know all the shortcuts, Help, Keyboard Shortcut Summary, and then what will happen is a web page will open with all the various shortcuts shown like so. If you want to, we do sell a specific shortcut keyboard for Capture One, Logic keyboard, which is available from your Phase One partner. So if you want to really get down to knowing all the shortcuts, our special keyboards with color-coded shortcuts really helps. Okay, so let's look at this kind of basic workflow. In Capture One Express. So as I said, roughly it's kind of a left to right workflow at the top. So we have our lens tool tab, which has lens corrections, which we'll talk about right now. We can actually change the order of those, possibly. I think that's pro feature only, my mistake. The lens tool tab has things about lens correction, which I said we'd talk about, and various compositional tasks. Then we have the exposure tool tab. We have the color tool tab, the details for sharpening and noise reduction, saving a style or preset if you wish, and some metadata and keywording tasks as well. But let's go back to the first one. And it's important to talk about lens corrections for Sony because you might see a couple of different things here as well. All of this is automatic, so you don't really have to worry about looking at this area if you don't want to. But whatever image that we pick, so you'll see that the lens profile changes. So we've got the 55mm there, for example. There's the 35mm, there's the 70 to 200, and so on and so forth. At Phase One HQ, we've profiled most of the Sony lenses. If you look in the Sony drop-up window, then you'll see there's a whole bunch of various different lenses there. If you happen to have a Sony lens which hasn't been profiled by us, don't panic because Sony are smart enough to put in enough raw data in the raw file or lens data in the raw file that we can actually use something called the manufacturer profile. So this is the data from the raw file that allows us to do lens corrections. The difference between the Sony profile and the Phase One profile is that we calculate an additional correction for sharpness fall off, which you can correct with a slider. Now the value of these sliders might sit at 0 if we feel personally that there isn't really much to correct for this lens. So in this case, if we look at the distortion, the 35mm lens, if we actually put in 100% correction, then it's barely anything, as you could see. So if we zero that back out, watch the corners, really not much to write home about. But if the lens is heavily distorted, and I've got a feeling I've got a shot here from, there we go. This is a good example. This is from the Sony RX100, and the distortion is actually pretty heavy on that camera, which is why by default we actually set that to 100. If I drop it down to 0, you can see the level of correction that's required for that particular lens, for example. So depending on the camera used, you might see some different values there, for example. But don't despair if it doesn't show your specific Sony lens profile. It's perfectly fine to use the manufacturer profile too. Okay, Gabrielle says, why don't we correct for the 35mm f1.4? Let's just check it's not actually there. Sony, for basically that reason I said, we're adding lenses all the time, and that's just one that we haven't added yet. Oh, there it is, Sony 35mm f1.4G. So it's there, Gabrielle. Don't worry. We're adding new lenses all the time, and as I said, don't worry if you don't see it, because the manufacturer profile actually does a really nice job too. If you want to disable lens corrections by default, it will happen automatically. You can just go into the sub menu there, which is the two dots, and disable default lens corrections like so. And that means we won't do any lens corrections whatsoever. But to be honest, you may as well have the benefit of the lens corrections going on. Okay, let's have a look at the more fun stuff about the various different exposure adjustments and things that we can do. So let's go back to our underexposed image, do Command B just to hide our browser. If you want to reset an image back to default, you can say reset or use the shortcut here, and that will take you back straight away to as it came out of camera. So this is a good example just to talk about white balance and exposure. The white balance tool, I'm sure I don't really have to educate you how to set white balance, but you've got the in-camera reading of white balance, and then you've got the various Sony presets that you can see here, or you can pick up the white balance picker, pick off something neutral, and then Capture One will figure out the white balance from there. We can see in this case I was pretty underexposed, so just by giving the exposure a lift, then we can correct for that. So looking straight down to the exposure slider, if you need to correct exposure, that's really the best way to do it. So right here, that's the closest thing to actually fixing it on the camera itself. If you're not overly keen or you don't want to understand what levels does, basically we can set our highlight and shadow points in the levels tool. If you don't want to really get into understanding what that is, I can simply say hit the A button for auto, and Capture One will do a pretty astounding job. So once you've fixed your exposure, for example, let's just go back to this one. Let's reset that. Once you're happy with your exposure, if you don't really want to manually set highlight and shadow level points, just hit the A button. Capture One does a pretty outstanding job for that. That really would be my best advice. Fix your exposure, get a good white balance, hit auto, and it's amazing how much you've already potentially done to the image. For example, if we just reset, let's go to this one, let's do Command R to reset. Exposure wise, we could just lift that up a little bit. White balance, the car was white, so we could probably just click around and find a white balance that we like. Hit auto on the levels, and there we go. Pretty good. And all we've done really is adjust, tweak the exposure, set the white balance, and hit an auto button there, and we're pretty much good to go. So once we're happy with those, we can think about contrast, brightness, and saturation. Now you might think that these are sort of tools to be wary of because they're sliders, but there's actually a heavy amount of intelligence built into these various different sliders, especially with regards to contrast. So let's just grab this image, for example, and I'm going to copy this a couple of times so we can do virtual copies of images. So I'm going to say, let's make a new variant, for example, and let's make another new variant like so. So 3 different variants, as you can see, and we're going to do a slightly different thing to each one. So let's say on this first image, we want to add a nice bit of contrast. I'm just going to reset the exposure tool. Let's just make sure each image is the same. I'm going to reset that whole image. So we've got 3 images the same, like so, 1, 2, 3, with kind of out of camera settings on them, no adjustments as such. So let's just white balance off that cloud, for example, and let's say we want to just do a slight contrast boost. So we're just going to drag the contrast slider, and we're going to do that until we're happy with our level of contrast. Now you might have been told in the past that using sliders is bad, but actually the contrast slider in Capture One does a really nice job. Now if you think you should be using the curves tool instead, let's do a similar thing with the curve. And the curve is great. It does allow you to make specific targeted adjustments over the image. But if we think of something just like a basic contrast adjustment, let's do something similar like that, maybe not quite as heavy. Now, if we look at the first one I did and the second one, what's the difference? Well, the second one, you can see the color has shifted quite a lot. And that's because when you adjust a curve to, let's say, modify contrast, you can't help but affect the color as well. That's just the nature of an RGB curve. But what the contrast slider is doing in the exposure tool, if we go back to this one, is that it's targeted much more at adjusting contrast and keeping the color of the image stable. So it's more like a luminosity adjustment, but it does add a little touch of saturation boost as well. So don't be afraid to use the contrast slider. It does a really nice job on your images. Gabrielle says the Luma Curve is an amazing tool. Yes, when we have a look at the Pro version, there's actually an additional curve called Luma, which is pure luminosity adjustment. What the contrast slider is a little bit in between a RGB curve like this and the full-on luminosity curve in the Pro version. But the contrast slider is a really good compromise between the two. Brightness is an easy one. That just makes the midtones brighter and darker. So this is like a midtone correction slider. It's actually very similar to doing this in the levels tool. Pretty much does the same thing, but it's a midtone adjustment. So it's very simple to understand that. Now the saturation slider also has some intelligence involved in it as well. Let's just use this image as an example. Colors that are already very well saturated will receive less treatment than those that are less saturated. So colors that sit at the high end of the saturation spectrum, if I just drag this slider up, yes, it gets more saturated, but nothing goes completely over the top or posterized or looks ugly or whatever, because there is some intelligence built into that slider. If we go in a negative fashion, then we just desaturate at a linear rate. But increasing saturation, you can be assured that the more saturated areas of the image are actually protected, like so. Okay, curve we've had a look at. Clarity is really the magic slider that makes every image look good. So what clarity does is also like our contrast adjustment, but it's only going to work on the midtones. So if we do a very aggressive contrast adjustment here, full on up to 50, see we start to, well, we've totally lost our shadow detail. We're starting to lose our highlights there, for example. So there's a limit sometimes to how far we can push contrast, but we might like the effect that it's having on other areas of the image, for example. So what clarity does is boost up our contrast, but only in the midtones, and our shadows and highlights are safe. So if I bump up the clarity, you can see what's happening. We can push it much harder. We don't destroy our shadows so much. Let's just reset our contrast. We don't destroy our shadows so much. We get a nice mid-tone bump, and then we also keep our highlights looking sweet as well. If we zoom in to the shot, we've got 4 different methods of clarity, which might sound excessive, but they all do a slightly different thing. Natural is the default, which gives you that nice contrast boost, but keeps the colors nice and stable. If we go to punch, see we get a little bit of a boost in saturation. If we go to neutral, sort of somewhere in between natural and punch. If we go from neutral to natural, you'll see it's just not quite as aggressive. And classic is a much older kind of version of clarity, which I don't personally like, but some people do. So it's there if you want to use it. But natural is your go-to one for adding contrast, but keeping the stability of color. Structure is like an edge finding sort of slider. So if you look at the scratches on the words here, and then we bump up structure, you see they suddenly become more apparent. So it's a good way of finding definition in any image. So something like sweaty cow noses or anything with fur or hair, if we bump up structure, then it just helps to exaggerate that. Landscapes, for example, with fine detail. Structure does a nice job of pulling them out as well. And architectural details. Can't remember if I got this in focus or not. Let's see. Just about. So again, if we bump up structure, then the brickwork looks better and so on. So it's a really good way for finding definition on anything that has like a high frequency structure. Not quite so good for skin tone, especially if you don't want to exaggerate skin, but there's nothing to stop you going in a negative fashion to soften parts of the image as well. And then finally, we have a good old fashioned, just zoom out, excuse me. It's double tap. So if you're, by the way, if you're on the hand tool and you double tap, then we can zoom into 100% and double tap to go out, or you can hit the big head and the little head like so. Alrighty. Where was I? Vignetting. That was it. So if we drop the vignetting down, then basically we get a vignette on the image. Very simple. The more you drag the slider to the left or right, it's darker, or if we go to the right, it's brighter. There's a really nice roll off from the top, obviously, to the center. It's not like a very hard edge or anything like that. It's a really nice soft bleed down towards the middle of the image. If you're correct in vignetting for a lens issue, then use the light fall off slider. So you see this particular lens, the 55, fully open. If I do 100% correction, then it's quite dramatic, as you can see. So if you need to fix lens light fall off, then use this tool, because the profile of the light fall off is going to vary lens to lens, whereas the vignetting has like a standard shape to it. If we come to the color tool tab, let's see what we can do there. So in the color editor, this basically allows us to pick a color and make some changes or edits to that color. Now we've got the 7 standard tones you can see here as we move around the wheel. But if you want to pick something specific, then we can grab the picker itself and then go on to a chosen color hue and click, and that will show us where on the color wheel that we are editing. If we tap on view selected color range, then everything will dip to monochrome. That is not going to be affected. And if you wish, you can actually squeeze down the area. You see, if we go in this, probably this direction, you see we pick up a bit of the desk, the sort of warmish tone in there, reddish tone. If we squeeze it up this way, then we can do a much better job of squeezing down those ranges. Once we're happy with that, we can turn off view selected color range. And then we can make some changes to the hue, for example, saturation, so you can see what's going on there, and density as well. Again, these sliders are quite well controlled. It's pretty hard to do anything that's going to totally mess up a color, although saying that, no, not too bad. So there's a maximum level here that we can go, which will allow you to give that saturation boost, but within the limits, of course, of not going too wild, as it were. In the Pro version, which we'll look at right at the end, there's also additional stuff we can do in the color editor as well, and a further color balance tool, which we can also change. If you're a fan of black and white, then I would certainly recommend using the black and white tool. Let's just think of a good example. Let's just go landscape, for example. Rather than doing this, which is dragging down saturation to 0, then that gives you a sort of a linear desaturation across the whole image. What the black and white tool will allow you to do, if we turn it on, is adjust the density of the various different tones in the image like so. So that just basically gives you much more control over the final result. So it allows you just to manipulate the densities in a different way to simply desaturating. You could also combine that with the contrast slider, of course, to edit your contrast as you wish to. But if you're into black and white, use the black and white tool. Don't just simply desaturate. In the next tab, we've got information on sharpening and noise reduction. And to be honest, because Sony produces such extremely good sensors, I would say stay away from here unless you really feel you need to make an adjustment. For example, with regards to sharpening, I personally find the defaults are actually pretty good. And the defaults vary from camera as well. So you might not see the same adjustments here, for example. So I would say if you don't really feel the need to edit it, then leave it well alone, or if you don't quite understand what the various different sliders are doing. But with sharpening, for example, if you want more sharpening on a very simple level, just grab the amount sharpening slider and move that to the right, and then for less sharpening, move it to the left as such. But generally, the defaults for the Sony sensors are pretty good, especially as noise-wise. I mean, this is ISO 800. No discernible noise whatsoever. We always had to be careful with noisier image that we didn't want to bring anything out. That's ISO 125, so no problem there. ISO 320, I think even some of the higher ISO shots that I've got, really they're so noise free that I really shouldn't see. ISO 1250, again very clean. So when we're talking about noise reduction, you always see 50, 50, 50, but there might be other stuff going on under the hood, because the levels of noise reduction that we place on the image varies depending on ISO and the camera type and so on. So just be aware of that. And I would also suggest that the defaults are pretty good here too as well. Like really in simple terms, if you want more noise reduction, drag this to the right, but the expense of softening the image. If you want less noise reduction, drag it to the left. But as I said, as the sensors are so good and the lenses are so good, I'm very rarely moving off default on these. Second to last tab, styles and presets. So if you want to save any of the adjustments you've made to an image to apply to others, you can save that as a style. Just a little tip, when you first save a style, then it will show you everything that you've applied to the current image. And there's some things that don't make sense to have as a style. For example, exposure correction is individual to each of the images, for example. So is levels. So is white balance, for example. If you've got any star rating or color tag, then that's something you should also deselect as well. So think about the kind of things, the style of the image that is universal and not specific things like exposure corrections and so on. Once you say save, you can save that as your style, give it a name so you know what it means. And then any other image you can go to and then pick up, for example, in the styles and presets tool, any of the various other styles that you might want to include, for example, like so, or any of the built-in styles that we have as well, whoops, like so. Finally, probably not much time to talk about it today, but in terms of applying keywords and using a keyword library. But when I talk about other resources that you can look at, then there's some good tutorials on working with those as well. Now, the final thing that, of course, we need to do is get some final images out. So in terms of TIFF, JPEGs, so on and so forth. So if I just hide my viewer again, let's just grab, a few of those, for example, and then we need to export them out. Very simply, we say File, Export Images, and Variants, like so. Originals will just get raw files, like a duplicate of the raw file with no adjustments as such, but we want to get our actual final images out. So if we say Export Variants, then the Export dialog pops up, and again, start at the top, work your way down. Where do we want our exports to go to? So let's say, well, the pictures folder. If we look at the pictures folder, that's this one. And that's kind of a good one to always target, because we can, again, like we did with the import, we can automate the export going into a different folder. So for example, if this was from vacation 2017, I could just do so like so, and Capture One would make that folder for me. Or we can use tokens like we did on the import, which basically pull out some information from the image or other metadata to create a folder. So for example, if I wanted to have today's date, so I could find those images easily, I could say current date like so. And then Capture One's going to make me a folder called Feb 16th, 2017, and those images will pop in there. But I never really have to change the destination because my master folder is always going to be the same, but I might like to put exports into different subfolders. We can rename if we wish, like so in the naming area. And then in recipe, this is where we set up the format that we want to have. So let's just have a JPEG. We can have TIFF, PNG, PSD, all kinds of other stuff. Change our JPEG quality, decide on the color space, decide on the size of the image or the resolution. In the Adjustments tab, we can add some additional sharpening for screen and print or turn all the sharpening off if we wish. Then we can decide what metadata we want to include and what metadata we don't want to include in that tab. So let's just keep it fairly simple and say export 8 variants like so. If we look at the activity window, you see it's pretty rapid. Once we get finish the export, then we get a indication that the export is done. So let's just go to my pictures folder. Then you can see Feb 16th, 27th, and then we've got all the various exports, as you can see, like so. So very simple. Of course, once that export thread is running, if you want to just export some other images, you can just do so as well. So very easy to get your images out of Capture One too. So how are we doing for time? We've got 8 minutes left as such. One thing that I didn't mention about catalogs, which you might want to explore once you get a bit more kind of comfortable with using Capture One, is that we saw some basic organization stuff we could do in the folders area, but you've also got the user collections area, just to point this out to you. You can always go back in the teaching archives or watch the introduction video. So we can say play intro video, which will talk about this area in a bit more detail. But the user collections area allows you to make simple things like albums. So if I make an album, might want to call that stuff to print, for example, then I can simply drag and drop images in there like so, or I can do a shift select and drag multiple images in there if I want to. And that just gives me another collection like a placeholder for images, but they're not moved from whatever their original location is on disk. So as well as albums, we also have smart albums. So the smart album will populate itself based on a certain criteria. So for example, if we wanted to just have a smart album that had 5-star images in it, I would give it a title like so, and then make the search criteria that the rating should equal 5 stars, like so. Or you can use a basic preset here like 1 or higher, 2, 3, 4, 5, or a color tag. So let's just say 5 stars. Then now if I select an image and hit 5 on my keyboard, you see it adds 5 stars here. Let's just press 5 again. Let's press 5 again. Excuse me. And 5 once more. And we look at the smart album, then it contains those images. So albums, simple drag and drop, smart albums populates itself. There's a couple of other items that you can use as well, but we don't quite have time for that today. So again, look at the previous materials so you know what's what. I'll link you to some other resources, so don't worry, you won't have to go hunting for it. Okay, so you've seen the basic stuff behind Capture One. Very simple to use, Capture One Express. Nothing to lose by trying it. It's free, of course. But let's say you've had a play with Express. You're ready to do more with your image adjustment and you want to try Pro. So how do you get to Pro? We've got to go to License up here in Capture One 10. On the PC version, it's under the File menu. I think it's in a different place. But just look for the license entry and pick that. Then we've got to say Change License and quit out of Capture One. Okay, so now when we start Capture One again, we're going to go back to this splash screen that we saw at the start. So now I'm going to say Pro for Sony, like so, and we're going to get a 30-day trial for you to evaluate. So if we say try, it'll actually load up the same catalog that you were using before. Let's cancel out of our import window. Going to get the splash screen again, have a look at the tutorials, of course, and get some inspiration on how to work with Capture One. But now, if you change to the default workspace, because you can save workspaces in Capture One Pro, in Express you can't. So if we go to the default workspace, then a whole bunch of other stuff will pop up as well. You can actually shoot tethered with your Sony camera. Now, I do have a Sony camera here, but I've got a feeling I left it on, so the battery's probably died, but let's see. We'll give it a try. So if you're tethered with the Sony camera, then you can shoot directly into Capture One, and you can see it pop up here, like so. This is in the Capture Tool tab, so that's a tool tab which you don't have in Capture One Express. So this is filled with tools all about tethered capture. The camera tool allows you direct control over the camera itself. Anything that you see lit up we can edit, so we can change my shutter, my aperture, my ISO, get a warning of the battery life. Oh, it's actually fully charged, that's good. Change exposure compensation, white balance, shooting file quality, and so on. Now, depending on the Sony camera attached, or if indeed you defect and go to Canon, Nikon, etc., then you might see various different options here. It's very much camera dependent. Connection, Gabrielle, is USB, just a basic USB connection, nothing more complicated or fancy than that. Some things you can't change, like the program mode, because that's mechanical on the camera potentially, or we just can't tell the camera to change it. So that's why it's frozen out here. But if I change it on the camera, so if I find the mechanical dial and just switch to shutter priority, then you see it syncs back to Capture One. You can also edit the AF, so we can ask the camera to shoot AF or just focus itself. Some cameras do live view. This particular one, the A7, doesn't support live view, so we can't see live view, but like the A7 II and so on does, or the A7R Mark II, for example, and the A7S and the A7S II. There's also some more settings which allow deeper control of the camera. But again, it depends on the camera, how much we can see in that particular tool. Okay, so if you want to shoot tethered, Capture One Pro is definitely what you need to be looking at. All the various tools you saw before. In the color tool, let's just bring up something with a bit of color. For example, let's just grab that, just so we've got some color to look at. In the color tool tab, we've got the additional color balance tool, which allows you to do color grading of an image. So that's a really nice additional sort of thing to have in your toolbox. So we have the shadows, midtones, and highlights, and then we can apply a creative color grade to the shot just by pushing the center dot to the various tone that we want in the color wheels itself. The color editor, we have a few more options. So we have the advanced tab, which gives you 30 different color picks, as opposed to the standard 7 that we have here, and even more ways to refine the color range that you want to edit, so you can be much more precise. There's also the skin tone tab, which allows you to take skin tones and correct them for uniformity. So any changes in hue, saturation, or lightness over someone's skin tone, we can correct with those sliders. So that's great if you do portrait work, headshot work, beauty work, and so forth. In the exposure tool tab, Gabrielle was raving about it earlier because we have the luminosity curve, Luma Curve here, which basically gives you a way to adjust contrast but keep the color totally stable. So the Luma Curve, and actually individual channel curves as well. But the Luma Curve is great because it simply means we can go to any image, adjust contrast, and the color is completely stable. We're only editing the contrast. So really nice addition. And then we have a few additional tools like film grain. So if you liked film grain emulation, Then we have some various different film grains that we can emulate and then apply over the image as well. It gives a really nice natural look. We have local adjustments, which allows us to do various, go away film grain, allows us to do various adjustments on the image itself. So if you just mask particular areas, for example, this will be a very rough mask, but then that gives me scope, for example, to adjust just the various parts of the image like so. So local adjustments part of Pro as well. We also have process recipes. So instead of simply having to say file, export and variants, that only allows you to do one kind of export at a time. What process recipes allow you to do is define exactly how you want to have your images exported and run them simultaneously. So I could have a JPEG running, a full-size TIFF running, images going to my client's cloud storage all simultaneously and being sorted automatically into their respective folders. So for high volume, high pressure work, then process recipes are a godsend. Good question from David. Does Capture One Pro work with the tangent color correction controllers? If you don't know what David is talking about, what David is talking about is actually a set of panels that I have on my desk, namely which give you a hardware input control into Capture One. So any of the products from Tangent, like the element system here or the ripple system, give you a hardware input into all the sort of various functionalities of Capture One. It's a great way to work, and you'll find a few sort of reviews over the internet about it. Traditionally used for video grading, but no reason why you can't use this kind of system for Capture One as well. So yes, David, it certainly does. You don't need to do anything additional or download, anything from Capture One or whatever. Just hook up your tangent gear and it will work very nicely. I actually did a webinar on that a few weeks back. So when you look up, when you get the additional information for the other learning resources, one of these will be the playlist for webinars. So you'll see the third one, or number 7 rather, is all about working with the tangent element and the customization you can do and so on. It's a great way to work. Once you've tried it, it's really difficult to go back to the traditional side of things, I'm afraid. Okay, in case you're interested to come back next week, and if you're interested in wedding or portraiture or retouching, I've got a guest, Chris Lambeth, who's a photographer from Arizona. Great photographer, really expert in Capture One. So he's going to talk a little bit about what he does with his the wedding side of things, the workflow that he does in Capture One and the adjustments and so on. So if you can join me with Chris next week, the sign up information will be in the follow-up email, along with links to other resources and also the recording for this webinar and the rest of those webinars you saw on that list as well. Phase1.com/download, of course, to download Capture One for Sony or Capture One Pro or Express for Sony if you haven't done so already. Remember, Express is free to use forever, for as long as the computer lasts, I guess. And the Pro version is on a 30-day trial, and you can upgrade to Pro for Sony for $50. The full version of Capture One is actually $299. So the Sony version is an absolute bargain. Absolutely all the same functionality, just for Sony cameras only. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I hope today was useful, and I hope to see you on a future webinar. And have a great day and rest of week. See you soon.